When the executioner's sword separated Anne Boleyn's head from her body, witnesses reported something that haunted them forever. Her lips kept moving. Her eyes stayed open, scanning the crowd. What scientists discovered about those final seconds is far more terrifying than anyone imagined. By the end of this video, you'll learn exactly what the oxygen left in her brain allowed her to see, and why modern neuroscience confirms she felt every moment of her own death. Executioners across Europe shared a dark secret that most refused to speak about publicly. For centuries, these men who made their living separating heads from bodies noticed something that defied all logical explanation. After the blade fell and the head rolled away from the body, they witnessed reactions that suggested the person was still somehow present, still aware, still experiencing what had just happened to them. Eyes would open wide and focus on faces in the crowd. Mouths would move as if trying to form words that could never be spoken. Facial expressions would shift from shock to what appeared to be genuine emotion, anger, confusion, even terror. These weren't subtle twitches or random muscle spasms. These were coordinated movements that implied consciousness, awareness, and perhaps most horrifying of all, the ability to feel and comprehend what was happening. The men who performed these executions, hardened professionals who had seen death in every conceivable form, began refusing assignments. Some abandoned their positions entirely, walking away from lucrative careers because they couldn't shake the feeling that they were inflicting something far worse than a quick death. They spoke in hushed voices about eyes that followed them, about expressions that changed in response to their actions, about the unmistakable sense that the severed head was still experiencing the world around it. The pattern wasn't limited to one country or one method of execution. From England to France, from Germany to Spain, executioners reported the same disturbing observations, century after century. One of the most documented cases that executioners whispered about involved Charlotte Corday, executed by guillotine in Paris on July 17, 1793, for assassinating Jean-Paul Marat. After her head was severed and fell into the basket below, the executioner, a man named François Legros, did something that would haunt historical records forever. He reached down, grabbed Charlotte's severed head by the hair, and held it up to show the crowd, as was customary. But then he did something unusual. Perhaps emboldened by the revolutionary fervor of the moment, or perhaps wanting to demonstrate that the condemned were truly dead and defeated, he slapped Charlotte Corday's face hard. What happened next was witnessed by hundreds of people and recorded by multiple observers who were present that day. Charlotte's cheeks, which had been pale in death, suddenly flushed a deep red. Her facial expression changed dramatically from the blank stare of death to what witnesses described as clear, unmistakable indignation and anger. Her eyes, which had been unfocused, seemed to sharpen and direct themselves toward Legros. The crowd gasped in horror and shock. Even hardened revolutionaries who had attended dozens of executions reported feeling disturbed by what they had seen. This wasn't imagination or mass hysteria. This was a coordinated physiological response that suggested Charlotte Corday had not only felt the slap but had reacted emotionally to the insult of it. Medical professionals in the crowd noted that the flush of color required blood circulation in the facial capillaries, a response that shouldn't have been possible if she was truly dead. The aftermath of Charlotte Corday's execution sent shockwaves through the medical and scientific community of the time. Physicians began seriously questioning whether decapitation was truly the humane, instantaneous death that proponents of the guillotine had claimed it to be. François Legros, the executioner who had slapped the severed head, was reprimanded by authorities not for cruelty to the condemned, but for creating a public spectacle that undermined confidence in the execution method. He later told friends that he regretted his action deeply, not because of any official punishment, but because Charlotte Corday's expression in that moment, the clear anger and awareness in her eyes, convinced him that she had been fully conscious and had felt everything. He reported having nightmares for years afterward, dreams where severed heads spoke to him, accusing him of inflicting torture rather than justice. Other executioners across France began reporting similar observations, and a disturbing pattern emerged. The more experienced and observant the executioner, the more likely they were to report signs of continued consciousness after decapitation. Some executioners began requesting transfers to prison guard positions or other work that didn't involve executions. The French government, concerned about maintaining public support for the guillotine as a revolutionary tool of justice, quietly discouraged physicians from publishing their observations or discussing them publicly. But if Charlotte Corday's case was disturbing, it was nothing compared to what happened on the execution scaffold at the Tower of London on May 19, 1536, when Anne Boleyn, Queen of England, faced the sword. Anne Boleyn's execution was supposed to be a mercy. King Henry VIII, despite condemning his second wife to death on charges of adultery, treason, and incest, had granted her one final kindness. Instead of the standard English method of beheading with an axe, which often required multiple blows and resulted in a prolonged, agonizing death, Henry brought in an expert swordsman from Calais, France. This executioner was renowned throughout Europe for his skill and precision. His technique involved a single, swift horizontal stroke that would sever the head from the body in one clean motion, supposedly providing the quickest, most painless death possible. Anne had requested this method herself, perhaps having heard the horror stories of botched axe executions where the condemned suffered through multiple blows before finally dying. She faced her death with remarkable courage, even removing her headdress herself and arranging her hair so that her neck was fully exposed, making the executioner's job as easy as possible. She knelt upright, as was required for a sword execution, rather than placing her head on a block. She prayed briefly, forgave her executioner in advance, and reportedly said that the blow would be so swift she would feel no pain. She was wrong about that last part. The crowd that had gathered to witness the execution included nobles, court officials, and members of the King's Council, all required to attend as witnesses to ensure the sentence had been carried out properly. The French swordsman lived up to his reputation. The blade passed through Anne Boleyn's neck in a single stroke so fast that witnesses reported barely seeing the motion. Her head separated from her body cleanly and fell forward, while her body remained kneeling for several seconds before toppling over. But what happened in those seconds immediately following the separation is what makes Anne Boleyn's execution one of the most significant cases in the historical debate about post-decapitation consciousness. Multiple witnesses, including members of the court who had been required to attend, reported in their private letters and journals that Anne's lips continued moving after her head was severed. Not just random twitching, but deliberate, coordinated movements that appeared to be attempting to form words. Her eyes remained wide open and seemed to scan across the crowd of observers. Several witnesses reported that her eyes appeared to focus on specific individuals, particularly on Thomas Cromwell, the king's chief minister who had orchestrated the charges against her. One observer wrote that her expression was one of surprise, as though she hadn't quite processed what had happened to her yet. Another noted that her eyes seemed to be searching, moving from face to face as if looking for someone or something. The Lady Kingston, who had attended Anne during her imprisonment and was present at the execution, later wrote to a friend that the sight of Anne's moving lips and searching eyes had given her nightmares for weeks afterward. The executioner himself, the professional swordsman from Calais, provided the most chilling testimony. In a letter written years later, he confessed that Anne Boleyn's execution had affected him profoundly, despite his extensive experience. He wrote that in the seconds after the blade passed through her neck, as he stood holding his sword and watching the head fall away from the body, he saw her eyes move. They didn't just move randomly, they tracked. They followed motion. For a brief moment, perhaps 3 or 4 seconds, her eyes found him. They locked onto his face with what he described as a look of confusion and dawning horror. Then her lips moved again and he was convinced she was trying to speak, trying to say something, though of course no sound could emerge without lungs to push air through vocal cords. The entire sequence lasted perhaps 10 to 15 seconds from the moment of separation until her eyes finally became fixed and vacant. But those 15 seconds, he wrote, felt like an eternity. He described having nightmares for months afterward, dreams where Anne Boleyn's severed head spoke to him, asking him why, asking him what had happened, unable to understand that she was dead because her consciousness was still functioning, even though her body was gone. He noted that he had performed dozens of executions before Anne and many after, but hers was the only one that truly haunted him, the only one that made him question whether what he did for a living was truly a service of justice or an act of profound cruelty. What makes Anne Boleyn's case particularly significant is not just the quality of the witnesses, who included educated nobles and court officials with no reason to fabricate such details, but also the fact that her execution method was supposed to be the fastest and most humane possible. If consciousness persisted even with a perfect, instantaneous decapitation performed by Europe's best executioner, then what did that mean for all the botched executions? The ones that required multiple blows, the ones where the condemned suffered through the blade, striking again and again before finally achieving separation? The answer to that question lies in one of the most horrific execution stories in history, and it involves understanding exactly what happens inside the human brain during those 15 seconds after the head is severed from the body. But before we explore that biological nightmare, we need to understand why the brain doesn't simply shut off instantly when separated from the body. And the answer has to do with oxygen, neurons, and the cruel reality of how consciousness actually works. The human body is designed with redundancies and reserves, survival mechanisms that keep us alive even during catastrophic trauma. Those same mechanisms that might save someone's life in an accident become instruments of prolonged suffering during an execution. The brain, that 3-pound mass of tissue that generates everything we think, feel, and experience, doesn't give up easily. The human brain is an extraordinarily complex organ that consumes about 20% of the body's total oxygen supply, despite representing only about 2% of body weight. This massive oxygen demand means the brain is constantly receiving fresh, oxygenated blood through the carotid arteries that run up through the neck. When those arteries are severed during decapitation, the supply of new oxygen immediately stops. But here's the critical detail that executioners and witnesses throughout history didn't understand. The brain doesn't run out of oxygen instantly. At the moment of decapitation, there is still oxygenated blood present in the brain's blood vessels and tissues. That residual oxygen is enough to maintain consciousness and neural function for a measurable period of time. Scientific studies on laboratory animals, which we'll discuss in detail later, have demonstrated that brain activity continues for 15 to 29 seconds after decapitation, depending on the species and conditions. During those seconds, the neurons in the brain are still firing, still processing information, still generating the subjective experience we call consciousness. The person, or what remains of their consciousness, is still present, still aware, still experiencing reality even though their head has been separated from their body. The brain cells don't die the instant blood flow stops because they're bathed in cerebral spinal fluid and surrounded by blood already present in the cranial cavity. That reserve, designed to protect the brain during brief interruptions in circulation, becomes the mechanism that prolongs awareness during execution. But oxygen depletion is only part of what makes those 15 seconds so horrifying. When the spinal cord is severed during decapitation, something catastrophic happens to the nervous system. The spinal cord is the highway through which all sensory information travels from the body to the brain, and through which all motor commands travel from the brain to the body. When that highway is suddenly cut, the brain experiences a massive, overwhelming surge of neural signals. Pain receptors in the neck, which are incredibly dense and sensitive, send an enormous pain signal to the brain in the microseconds before the connection is severed. But even after the physical connection is lost, the brain continues processing. It's suddenly receiving no sensory input from the body below the neck, no proprioceptive feedback about limb position, no information about whether the heart is beating or the lungs are breathing. The brain, which has spent an entire lifetime integrated with the body, suddenly finds itself isolated, cut off, floating in a sensory void. Simultaneously, the brain is experiencing the visual and auditory input from the head's sensory organs, the eyes and ears, which remain functional and connected to the brain. So the person sees the world tumbling or being held up, hears the sounds of the crowd, feels their face and head, but has absolutely no sensation from or control over the body that is no longer there. The disconnect creates a nightmare scenario where consciousness remains, but the familiar integration of mind and body is catastrophically broken. Modern neuroscience has given us insight into what this experience might actually feel like, and it's more terrifying than anyone in the 16th or 18th century could have imagined. When the brain realizes it has lost connection with the body, it likely experiences what neuroscientists call proprioceptive catastrophe. The brain frantically tries to send motor commands to move limbs, to breathe, to make sound, but receives no feedback whatsoever. It's similar to what some people experience during sleep paralysis, that horrifying sensation of being awake and aware but completely unable to move or speak, except multiplied by 1,000 because the body isn't just paralyzed, it's gone. The brain floods with stress hormones, adrenaline, cortisol, norepinephrine, all released in a massive surge as the body's, or in this case the head's, emergency response kicks in. This chemical flood can actually intensify consciousness temporarily, making the person hyper-aware of what's happening. They're not drifting peacefully into unconsciousness. They're experiencing a sharp, clear, terrifying awareness that something catastrophic has happened. Their visual field is likely unstable as the head falls or is held up, creating a disorienting spinning sensation. They try to breathe and can feel their mouth and throat moving, but no air comes because there are no lungs attached anymore. They try to scream, but no sound emerges because there's no air to vibrate the vocal cords. The psychological experience is one of total helplessness combined with acute awareness of one's own dying process, a nightmare scenario that continues for those endless 15 seconds. The pain component is perhaps the most debated aspect of post-decapitation consciousness, but the scientific evidence suggests it's very real. When the blade passes through the neck, it severs skin, muscle, blood vessels, the esophagus, the trachea, and most critically, the spinal cord. All of these tissues are densely innervated with pain receptors called nociceptors. The instant of cutting generates a massive pain signal, one of the most intense pain signals the human nervous system can experience. Some have argued that the shock and speed of decapitation might prevent pain sensation, that the nervous system might be so overwhelmed it simply shuts down. But studies on pain processing show that the brain can perceive and process pain signals in milliseconds, far faster than the time it takes for shock to set in. The condemned almost certainly feels the blade cutting through their neck in the instant before separation occurs. Then, after separation, there's a secondary wave of pain as damaged nerve endings continue firing. This is similar to phantom limb pain, where amputees feel intense pain in limbs that no longer exist because the severed nerves continue sending pain signals. In the case of decapitation, the severed spinal cord and neck nerves would be sending overwhelming pain signals to the brain for several seconds until the neurons finally die from oxygen deprivation. The pain doesn't stop just because the head is separated. It continues and may even intensify as the damaged nerves fire chaotically in their final moments of function. Beyond the physical sensations, there's the psychological horror of awareness and comprehension. The person's cognitive functions, their ability to think, understand, and process what's happening, remain intact during those 15 seconds. They can see the crowd, they recognize faces, they understand that they've been executed, they realize that their head has been separated from their body, and they comprehend that they are dying. This metacognitive awareness, the ability to think about one's own thinking and situation, is what makes human consciousness so unique, and in this case, so horrifyingly cruel. A person in those final seconds isn't just experiencing pain and sensory chaos, they're understanding what has happened to them. They're processing the fact of their own death while still conscious. They're experiencing what might be the most existentially terrifying moment possible, being aware that you are dead or dying, but still conscious enough to think about it. And there's absolutely nothing they can do. They cannot scream because they have no lungs. They cannot move because they have no body. They can only experience, observe, and comprehend their own obliteration in those final eternal seconds before the oxygen runs out and consciousness finally mercifully ends. Some neuroscientists believe this forced confrontation with one's own death while still conscious might generate the most intense fear and distress the human brain is capable of experiencing. A perfect storm of physical pain, psychological terror, and existential horror all compressed into 15 seconds that must feel like an eternity. If the execution of Anne Boleyn demonstrated what happens during a perfect single-stroke decapitation, then the execution of Mary Queen of Scots demonstrated the absolute nightmare of what happens when things go wrong. Mary Stuart, Queen of Scots, was executed on February 8, 1587, at Fotheringhay Castle in England. She had been imprisoned by her cousin, Queen Elizabeth I, for 19 years on charges of plotting to assassinate Elizabeth and claim the English throne. When Elizabeth finally reluctantly signed Mary's death warrant, the execution was scheduled to be carried out by axe, the standard English method. Mary faced her death with courage and dignity, forgiving her executioners in advance and praying for her soul and for Elizabeth. She placed her head on the block and waited for the blow. What happened next was one of the most horrifying botched executions in recorded history, and the detailed eyewitness accounts give us a window into what the condemned experienced when decapitation wasn't instantaneous. The execution chamber was filled with witnesses, including nobles, officials, and even some of Mary's own servants who had been permitted to attend. They would all carry the memory of what they saw for the rest of their lives, and several would provide detailed written accounts that have survived to the present day. The executioner, likely nervous about the political significance of executing a queen, swung his axe and missed his mark. Instead of striking cleanly through Mary's neck, the blade hit the back of her head, crashing into her skull with tremendous force but not severing the neck. Mary Stuart was still alive, still conscious, and had just experienced an axe blade smashing into the back of her head. Eyewitnesses reported hearing a sound from Mary, a low moan or cry that indicated she was not only alive but aware and in pain. The executioner, now likely panicking, raised the axe again. The second blow struck deeper, cutting through much of the neck, but still didn't achieve complete separation. The axe hit bone, cervical vertebrae, and stuck. Mary was still alive, still conscious. Now with her neck partially severed, the axe embedded in her spine, blood pouring from the massive wounds. The witnesses described the scene as nightmarish, with Mary's body moving slightly, her hands reportedly clenching, indicating not just life but awareness. The executioner had to wrench the axe free from where it had lodged in Mary's vertebrae, then raise it a third time. Only on the third blow did he finally manage to separate the head from the body, though even then he had to use the axe to saw through the remaining tissue and sinew that still connected them. The entire ordeal from first blow to final separation took nearly a minute, during which Mary Queen of Scots was conscious and experiencing unimaginable trauma. The horror of Mary Queen of Scots' execution goes beyond the physical brutality of requiring 3 blows. Consider what she experienced mentally during those seconds or minutes between the first blow and the third. After the first blow struck the back of her head, she would have felt overwhelming pain as the axe crashed into her skull. But she would have also felt the impact of being struck with an axe and the realization that the executioner had missed. In that moment, she knew she was still alive, still conscious, and that another blow was coming. She couldn't move, couldn't speak, could only wait in terror for the axe to fall again. When the second blow came and cut partially through her neck, she would have experienced the sensation of her neck being cut open, the feeling of the blade passing through tissue and hitting bone, the warm rush of blood, and the beginning of that catastrophic sensory disconnect as nerves were severed. But she was still alive, still aware, now experiencing not just pain but the dawning understanding of what was happening to her body. Some witnesses reported that after the second blow, Mary's lips were still moving in what appeared to be prayer. Her eyes were open. She was conscious through 2 axe blows to the neck. The psychological torture of experiencing a failed execution, of knowing you're supposed to be dead but you're still aware and feeling everything, adds a dimension of horror that goes beyond physical pain. Mary knew what was supposed to happen, knew the execution should have been over, but found herself trapped in a nightmare of continued consciousness and repeated trauma. After the third blow finally separated Mary's head from her body, the witnesses reported something that has become one of the most famous and disturbing details of the execution. When the executioner held up Mary's head to show the crowd, as was traditional, the head fell out of his hand. He was left holding Mary's wig while her actual head, now revealed to be mostly gray-haired and older than the elegant auburn wig suggested, fell to the floor. But that's not the most disturbing part. After the head fell and rolled slightly, witnesses reported that Mary's lips continued moving for approximately 15 seconds. The movements were described as deliberate and coordinated, appearing to be the continuation of the prayer she had been reciting before the execution. Her eyes remained open for several seconds more before finally becoming fixed and vacant. Even after experiencing 2 non-fatal blows in the final separation, Mary Queen of Scots was still conscious, still aware, still trying to pray in those final moments. The executioner later reported that the experience traumatized him so severely he could never perform another execution. He abandoned his position and disappeared from historical records, presumably unable to cope with what he had witnessed and caused. Several of the witnesses who had been present also reported lasting psychological effects, with nightmares and intrusive thoughts about what they had seen. One nobleman wrote in his diary that he could never attend another execution after witnessing Mary's ordeal, describing it as the most disturbing thing he had ever witnessed in his life. The medical reality of what Mary experienced is almost unbearable to contemplate. The first blow to the back of her head would have caused immediate severe cranial trauma. The impact would have sent shockwaves through her brain, likely causing temporary confusion and disorientation, similar to a severe concussion. But it wouldn't have rendered her unconscious immediately. She would have felt the pain, felt the impact, and retained enough consciousness to understand what had happened and to anticipate the next blow. The second blow, cutting partially through her neck, would have generated even more intense pain as the axe severed skin, muscle, major blood vessels, and began cutting into the spinal cord. At this point, she might have lost sensation and motor control in her body due to spinal cord damage, creating that horrifying proprioceptive catastrophe we discussed earlier. She could still see, still hear, still think, but her body would have stopped responding to her commands. The blood loss from the severed carotid arteries would have been massive, but the brain can maintain consciousness even with significant blood loss for a short period. When the third blow finally separated her head completely, she would have experienced that same 15 seconds of isolated consciousness that Anne Boleyn likely experienced, but with the added trauma of having already endured 2 previous blows and the accumulating effects of blood loss and head trauma. The compounding injuries didn't spare her from those final seconds of awareness. They likely made them even more disorienting and terrifying as her damaged brain struggled to process what was happening. Mary's execution wasn't an isolated case of botched decapitation. Historical records are full of executions that required multiple blows, sometimes 5, 6, or even more attempts before the head was finally separated. Each of these represents a person who experienced repeated, failed attempts to kill them, who felt multiple axe blows, who remained conscious through a prolonged ordeal of unimaginable pain and terror. The English execution of Margaret Pole, Countess of Salisbury in 1541 is perhaps the most horrific example. The executioner was inexperienced and reportedly nervous. His first blow struck her shoulder instead of her neck. She stood up from the block and tried to run. The executioner chased her around the scaffold, striking her repeatedly with the axe, hitting her head, neck, and shoulders multiple times before finally killing her. Margaret Pole was 67 years old and experienced what can only be described as a torture death rather than an execution, all while fully conscious and aware. These cases make clear that the 15 seconds of consciousness after a perfect decapitation was actually the best-case scenario. For many condemned prisoners, the experience was far longer and far worse. In some cases, executioners were so incompetent or the equipment so poorly maintained that the condemned suffered for minutes rather than seconds. Trapped in a nightmare of repeated blows, mounting injuries, and undiminishing consciousness that refused to fade until the physical damage was finally catastrophic enough to end brain function. The scientific investigation into post-decapitation consciousness didn't begin with modern neuroscience. It started during the French Revolution, when the guillotine was being used daily to execute prisoners, and physicians had unprecedented opportunities to observe what happened immediately after decapitation. The sheer volume of executions, with dozens of people being guillotined in a single day during the height of the terror, meant that multiple trained observers could watch for patterns and document what they saw. And what they saw disturbed them deeply. Dr. Jean-Joseph Sue, a prominent French physician, observed numerous guillotine executions and reported that, in many cases, the severed heads showed signs of consciousness. Eyes would move and focus on objects. Faces would contort into expressions of pain or surprise. Mouths would open and close. These weren't isolated incidents happening in 1 or 2 executions. They were consistent patterns observed across hundreds of cases. Dr. Sue became convinced that decapitation did not produce instant death, and that the guillotine, far from being the humane execution method it was promoted as, actually prolonged suffering by keeping the head intact and undamaged except for the severing itself. He argued that the very efficiency of the guillotine, its ability to separate the head cleanly without causing additional cranial damage, meant that the brain remained functional longer than it would have with a cruder method that might have also caused fatal brain trauma. The most systematic and famous investigation was conducted by Dr. Gabriel Bourrieux in 1905, decades after the French Revolution, but while France was still using the guillotine for executions. Dr. Bourrieux received permission to conduct an experiment immediately following the execution of a prisoner named Henri Longueuil. The experiment was simple but profound. As soon as Longueuil's head was severed and fell into the basket below the guillotine, Dr. Bourrieux called out his name. According to Bourrieux's published report, Henri Longueuil's eyes, which had been closed, slowly opened. The eyes didn't just open randomly, they focused. They directed themselves toward Dr. Bourrieux, making clear eye contact. The expression in the eyes was alert and aware, showing what Bourrieux described as recognition. Then the eyes closed again. Bourrieux waited a few seconds and called the name a second time. Again, the eyes opened. Again, they focused on Bourrieux's face, and again they showed signs of consciousness and awareness before closing. Bourrieux attempted a third time, but there was no response. The entire sequence, from the moment of decapitation to the final loss of response, lasted approximately 25 to 30 seconds. Longueuil had been conscious and responsive for most of that time. Bourrieux's detailed report, published in medical journals, sparked intense debate in the scientific community and led to renewed calls to abolish the death penalty entirely in France, though it would be decades before that finally happened. Bourrieux's experiment was controversial then and remains controversial now. Some critics argued he was seeing random muscle movements and interpreting them as conscious responses. But Bourrieux was a trained physician, specifically watching for signs of consciousness. The responses he described, eyes opening on command, focusing on a specific face, showing appropriate recognition, happened twice in succession and then stopped. Exactly the pattern you would expect if consciousness was fading gradually rather than absent from the start. Other physicians conducted similar experiments with similar results. Dr. Dassy de Lignières reported cases where severed heads attempted to bite when objects were brought near their mouths, a complex coordinated action that requires significant neural processing and cannot be explained by simple reflexes. Multiple observers reported seeing severed heads with eyes that tracked movement, following people as they walked past, a behavior that requires visual processing in the brain's occipital cortex and coordination between eye muscles, something far too complex to be random spasm. The cumulative evidence from these revolutionary and post-revolutionary observations pointed to an uncomfortable conclusion that consciousness did persist after decapitation, and that the guillotine was not the painless, instant death its proponents claimed. Medical professionals who had initially supported the guillotine as a humane innovation began publicly questioning whether any method of execution that involved decapitation could truly be considered merciful, given what they had observed and documented about post-severance consciousness. The debate reached a peak in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, when prominent scientists and physicians began openly questioning whether any form of decapitation could be considered humane. The evidence was overwhelming. Historical accounts from executioners spanning centuries, detailed observations from trained physicians, experimental tests showing responses to stimuli, and the simple biological fact that the brain contains residual oxygen after blood flow stops all pointed to the same conclusion. But the implications were deeply troubling for governments that still used beheading as an execution method. If decapitation didn't produce instant death, if the condemned experienced consciousness and potentially pain for 15 to 30 seconds after their head was severed, then these executions violated the principle that punishment should not be cruel or unusual. France eventually abolished the death penalty entirely in 1981, but countries that still use decapitation as an execution method have largely ignored or dismissed this scientific evidence, continuing to claim that death is instantaneous, despite all evidence to the contrary. But we don't have to rely solely on historical observations anymore because modern neuroscience has given us the tools to measure exactly what happens in the brain after decapitation. The development of electroencephalography and other brain monitoring technologies has allowed scientists to directly measure neural activity rather than relying on external observations of behavior. And what those measurements reveal is both fascinating and deeply disturbing. In 2011, researchers at Radboud University in the Netherlands conducted a study that finally provided objective, measurable evidence of post-decapitation consciousness. The researchers used laboratory rats and electroencephalography (EEG) technology to measure brainwave activity before, during, and after decapitation. The results were striking and disturbing. After the rats were decapitated, their brains showed organized electrical activity for up to 17 seconds. This wasn't random neural noise or dying neurons firing chaotically. The EEG patterns showed waves of activity consistent with conscious brain function. The researchers identified a specific pattern called a wave of death, where synchronized neural activity swept across the brain, likely corresponding to the moment when oxygen depletion reached critical levels and consciousness finally ended. But before that final wave, the brain was active, processing, functioning. The rats' brains were conscious for those 17 seconds after their heads were separated from their bodies. A follow-up study in 2018 provided even more detail, using more sophisticated EEG equipment and analysis. This study detected organized brainwave patterns for up to 29 seconds after decapitation in some cases, nearly 30 seconds of measurable consciousness after the head was severed. The researchers noted that the brainwave patterns during those seconds showed characteristics consistent with sensory processing, suggesting the rats weren't just technically alive, but actually experiencing and processing their environment during that time. The implications of these studies for understanding human executions are profound and horrifying. Rats have smaller brains than humans and presumably simpler conscious experiences. If a rat's brain remains conscious for 17 to 29 seconds after decapitation, a human brain with its vastly greater complexity and oxygen reserves likely remains conscious for a similar period, perhaps even longer. The 15 seconds that witnesses historically reported seeing signs of consciousness in human executions aligns perfectly with these scientific measurements. Anne Boleyn's moving lips and focusing eyes weren't imagination or coincidence. They were real, observable signs of consciousness. Mary Queen of Scots' continued prayer after 3 axe blows wasn't posthumous reflex. It was a dying woman still conscious, still aware, still trying to seek comfort in her faith as her life ended. Charlotte Corday's reaction to being slapped wasn't muscle spasm. It was genuine emotional response to an insult, experienced by a consciousness that was still present in her severed head. Henri Longueuil's eyes opening and focusing on Dr. Bourrieu weren't random movements. They were deliberate responses to hearing his name called, evidence of a mind still functioning despite the catastrophic trauma. Every historical account that described signs of continued awareness after decapitation, accounts that skeptics dismissed as exaggeration or misinterpretation, has been vindicated by modern neuroscience that proves consciousness persists for those terrible 15 to 30 seconds. Subscribe to this channel right now because this isn't just history, it's neuroscience that challenges everything we thought we knew about consciousness, death, and the human experience. Hit that subscribe button to join others who want real answers to questions that society would prefer to keep buried. Drop a comment below with your honest reaction. Could you handle those 15 seconds of awareness, knowing your head had been severed, unable to scream, unable to move, only able to watch and feel as consciousness fades? Your comments help this research reach people who need to understand what really happens in those final moments. And smash that like button if you believe this scientific evidence should force a worldwide conversation about execution methods that still involve decapitation. Modern medicine has proven what witnesses saw for centuries. Those 15 seconds are real and they're conscious. Every like, every comment, every subscription helps push this information to people who can use it to advocate for change, to understand the full implications of historical executions, and to recognize that what seemed like medieval horror stories were actually accurate descriptions of biological reality.